The Vikings came from northern lands, where good farmland was scarce and winters were long. England offered fertile fields, mild climate, and wealthy monasteries. But more than resources, it offered opportunity. Here, a younger son with no inheritance could become a lord. A skilled warrior could win gold and glory. A merchant could access European trade routes. England wasn't just a target for Vikings, it became their promised land, their new home. Before that first Viking longship appeared on the horizon, England was a very different place. The year was approaching 793, and the island we now call England was actually a collection of separate kingdoms, each with its own king, its own laws, and its own destiny. These kingdoms had names that sound strange to modern ears. Northumbria stretched across the north, from coast to coast. Mercia dominated the middle lands. East Anglia held the eastern bulge of the country. Wessex controlled the south and west. Kent, Essex, and Sussex were smaller but still independent. Each kingdom had its own character, its own strengths, and its own weaknesses. The people living in these kingdoms called themselves Anglo-Saxons. Their ancestors had come from northern Germany and Denmark several centuries earlier, ironically from lands very close to where the Vikings would later emerge. They had pushed out or absorbed the native Britons, who retreated to Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. By the late 700s, the Anglo-Saxons had been Christian for more than a century. They built beautiful stone churches and monasteries. They created illuminated manuscripts with gorgeous decorations. They accumulated gold and silver in their religious houses, never imagining that this wealth would soon attract the attention of raiders from across the sea. Life in Anglo-Saxon England followed the rhythm of the seasons. Most people were farmers, living in small villages surrounded by fields. They grew wheat and barley, raised cattle and sheep, and lived in wooden houses with thatched roofs. The nobility lived in larger halls, where warriors gathered to feast and listen to poets, tell stories of ancient heroes. Kings travelled constantly around their kingdoms, staying at different royal estates, consuming the food taxes their subjects provided. It was a world of personal relationships, where loyalty to your lord mattered more than abstract ideas of nationality. The Anglo-Saxons were not primitive people. They had sophisticated laws, written in their own language rather than Latin. They minted silver coins that were accepted across Europe. Their craftsmen created incredible jewellery, working with gold, garnets, and coloured glass. The Kingdom of Mercia, under King Offa, had recently built an enormous earthwork along the Welsh border, showing they could organise massive construction projects. Their scholars exchanged letters with the court of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor. England was connected to European civilization, prosperous and largely at peace with itself. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, the Scandinavian world was experiencing dramatic changes. The lands we now call Norway, Sweden and Denmark were home to Germanic peoples who shared distant ancestry with the Anglo-Saxons. But while England had become Christian and settled, Scandinavia remained pagan and restless. The Norse people, as we often call them, worshipped gods like Odin, Thor and Freyr. They lived in a harsh landscape of mountains, forests and fjords, where good farmland was scarce and precious. The Norse had always been skilled sailors, but around the 700s they developed a new technology that would change history. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering. These vessels were long and narrow, with shallow draughts that let them sail up rivers as easily as across oceans. They had both oars and sails, making them fast and manoeuvrable. The ships were built using overlapping planks, a technique called clinker building, which made them flexible enough to ride ocean waves without breaking. A typical longship could carry 30 to 60 warriors, along with their weapons, supplies, and plunder. But why did the Vikings suddenly start raiding? Historians have debated this question for generations. Population pressure certainly played a role. Scandinavia was experiencing a population boom, and in a society where the eldest son inherited everything, Younger sons needed to find their fortunes elsewhere. Political consolidation was another factor. Powerful kings were emerging in Scandinavia, forcing defeated rivals and their followers to seek new homes. Trade routes were expanding too. Scandinavian merchants were already sailing to markets across Europe, and they brought back stories of wealthy kingdoms and especially undefended monasteries full of treasure. The Norse society that produced the Vikings was complex and sophisticated in its own way. They had a rich oral literature of myths and sagas. Their metalworkers created beautiful artifacts, from practical tools to elaborate jewellery. They had a complex legal system based on assemblies called things, where free men could speak and vote. Women had more rights than in most European societies, able to own land, request divorces, and run households in their husband's absence. This was not a primitive culture, but rather a different path of development from Christian Europe. The first Scandinavian traders and raiders probably visited Britain long before the famous attack on Lindisfarne. Archaeological evidence suggests peaceful contact and trade. Norse merchants brought amber, furs, and walrus ivory to English markets. Some may have served as mercenaries for Anglo-Saxon kings. But these early contacts were small-scale and generally peaceful. The Anglo-Saxons had no reason to fear the Northmen. That was about to change dramatically. The monastery of Lindisfarne, also called Holy Island, sat off the coast of Northumbria in northeastern England. It was one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Saint Aidan had founded it in 635, and it had become a centre of learning and art. The monks there had created the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the masterpieces of medieval art. The monastery was wealthy, holding treasures donated by generations of faithful Christians. It was also completely undefended. The monks were holy men, not warriors. The very idea of attacking a monastery was unthinkable in Christian society. This made Lindisfarne and places like it perfect targets for raiders who didn't share Christian taboos. The political situation in England also created opportunities for raiders. The kingdoms were often at war with each other, weakening their ability to respond to external threats. Northumbria, once the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom, was torn by civil wars and succession disputes. Mercia and Wessex were locked in their own rivalry. There was no unified English defence, no coordinated response to threats from the sea. Each kingdom had to defend itself, and coastal areas were especially vulnerable. The Anglo-Saxon military system was not designed to handle seaborne raids. Each kingdom had a fyrd, a militia of free farmers who could be called to fight. But it took time to gather the fyrd, and by then, fast-moving raiders could strike and disappear. The kingdoms also had professional warriors called thanes, who served the king and great nobles. But these warriors were scattered across the kingdom, protecting their lords' estates. There was no standing army, no rapid response force. The Anglo-Saxons were prepared to fight other Anglo-Saxons in formal battles, not to chase raiders who appeared without warning from the sea. The church's wealth made it an especially tempting target. Over centuries, Christians had donated land, gold, silver, and precious objects to monasteries and churches. Monks and priests wore elaborate vestments decorated with gold thread. Churches displayed crosses and reliquaries made of precious metals and decorated with jewels. Books were covered in elaborate bindings with ivory and metalwork. To Christian eyes, using these treasures to glorify God was natural and proper. To pagan raiders, it was an invitation to plunder. The trading networks of the North Sea also played a role in the coming raids. Scandinavian merchants knew exactly where the wealthy monasteries were located. They knew which rivers led to important towns. They understood the political divisions between the English kingdoms. When the decision came to raid rather than trade, the Vikings had excellent intelligence about their targets. They knew where to find wealth and how to avoid strong resistance. Climate change may have contributed to the Viking expansion as well. The medieval warm period was beginning, making agriculture more productive in Scandinavia and opening new sea routes as ice retreated. This allowed larger populations and made sea travel easier and safer. The same warming that benefited Scandinavia also made England more prosperous, creating more wealth for Vikings to plunder or trade for. The Scandinavian shipbuilding tradition reached a crucial point of development just as these other factors converged. Master shipbuilders had perfected designs that balanced speed, cargo capacity, and seaworthiness. The shallow draft of Viking ships, often less than a metre, meant they could sail far up rivers that would block other vessels. They could also be dragged short distances over land between river systems. This gave Vikings strategic mobility that their victims couldn't match. The religious divide between pagan Scandinavia and Christian England created a psychological advantage for the raiders. Vikings felt no guilt about attacking churches or killing monks. In their worldview, successful raiding brought honour and divine favour. The Christian Anglo-Saxons, meanwhile, were often paralysed by the sacrilege of these attacks. Some saw Viking raids as divine punishment for their sins, leading to spiritual crisis rather than military response. Norse society's emphasis on personal honour and reputation drove young men to seek glory through raiding. The greatest honour came from facing danger and returning with wealth and stories of adventure. A successful raiding voyage could transform a young man's status, allowing him to attract followers, marry well, and establish himself as a leader. This cultural pressure created a constant supply of eager raiders. The technology gap between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons was not enormous, but it favoured the attackers in crucial ways. Viking weapons were excellent, especially their swords, which used sophisticated forging techniques to create flexible yet strong blades. Their axes were devastating in close combat. Their round shields and mail shirts provided good protection. But most importantly, their ships gave them the initiative. They could choose when and where to attack, concentrating their forces against weak points. As the 8th century drew to a close, all these factors aligned perfectly for the Viking Age to begin. Scandinavia had the population, technology, and motivation to raid. England had the wealth to make raiding profitable, and the disunity to make it feasible. The stage was set for 3 centuries of conflict, conquest, and cultural transformation. The Anglo-Saxons, secure in their prosperity and faith, had no idea what was about to hit them. On the 8th of June 793, the world changed forever for the people of England. That morning started like any other at the monastery of Lindisfarne. Monks rose before dawn for prayers, their voices echoing through the stone church in ancient Latin chants. Some prepared breakfast in the kitchen while others worked in the scriptorium, carefully copying religious texts. The vegetable gardens needed tending, and there were always repairs to make on the buildings. It was a peaceful, ordered life, dedicated to God. Then someone spotted the ships. The strange vessels approaching from the northeast were unlike anything the monks had seen before. Long and sleek, with square sails bearing unfamiliar symbols, they moved through the water with frightening speed. As they drew closer, the monks could see they were full of armed men. Perhaps at first the brothers thought these were traders or travellers seeking shelter. But when the ships reached the shore and warriors leapt out with weapons drawn, terrible understanding dawned. These were raiders, and they were heading straight for the monastery. What happened next shocked the Christian world to its core. The Vikings, for that is what these Northmen would come to be called, showed no respect for the sanctity of the monastery. They broke down doors, overturned altars, and seized everything of value. Gold and silver crosses disappeared into sacks. Illuminated manuscripts were torn apart for their jewelled covers. Some monks were killed outright, their blood spilling on sacred ground. Others were captured to be sold as slaves. The raiders showed particular violence toward the religious symbols, perhaps deliberately desecrating them to show their contempt for the Christian God. The attack probably lasted only a few hours. The Vikings were not interested in occupying Lindisfarne or destroying it completely. They wanted portable wealth, and once they had it, they returned to their ships and sailed away. Behind them, they left a scene of devastation that would haunt English consciousness for generations. The survivors struggled to understand what had happened. How could God allow his holy place to be violated? Why had these pagans been permitted to triumph over Christian monks? News of the Lindisfarne raid spread across England and beyond with remarkable speed. Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar living at Charlemagne's court in France, wrote anguished letters about the attack. He saw it as divine punishment for the sins of the English people. What should be expected for other places, he wrote, when the divine judgment has not spared this holy place? His words captured the psychological impact of the raid. If Lindisfarne could be attacked, nowhere was safe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our main historical source for this period, recorded the raid with horror. The chronicler wrote of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning and fiery dragons flying through the air. These omens were followed by famine, and then the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The language reveals how deeply the raid shocked Anglo-Saxon society. This was not just a military attack, but a spiritual catastrophe. The following year, Vikings struck again, this time at the monastery of Jarrow, further south on the Northumbrian coast. But here they met resistance. The locals had been warned by Lindisfarne's fate and were better prepared. According to one account, a storm wrecked some Viking ships, and the leader was captured and executed. This showed that Vikings were not invincible, but it did little to reduce the fear they inspired. In 795, Viking raids expanded beyond Northumbria. They attacked the monastery on Iona, off the Scottish coast, beginning a pattern of raids on Irish monasteries that would continue for decades. They also appeared in Wales and on the southern English coast. These early raids followed a similar pattern. Small fleets of perhaps 3 to 6 ships would appear, without warning, attack isolated monasteries or wealthy settlements, and disappear before any organised resistance could form. The Vikings chose their targets carefully. Monasteries were ideal because they were wealthy, poorly defended, and often located on islands or coastal promontories for spiritual isolation. This isolation, which helped monks focus on prayer, also made them vulnerable to seaborne attack. Markets and trading centres were also targeted, especially during fairs when merchants gathered with their goods and silver. The Vikings had excellent intelligence, probably from Scandinavian traders who knew exactly when and where wealth would be concentrated. These early raiders were not organised armies but independent groups of warriors led by ambitious leaders. A successful warrior who owned a ship might gather friends, relatives and followers for a summer voyage. They would raid for several weeks or months, then return home with their plunder before winter storms made sailing dangerous. This was seasonal warfare, fitting between spring planting and autumn harvest. Many Vikings were part-time raiders and part-time farmers. The Anglo-Saxon response to these early raids was confused and ineffective. Kings were used to fighting other Anglo-Saxon armies in formal battles, not chasing seaborne raiders. The Fyrd took time to assemble, and by the time local forces gathered, the Vikings were gone. Coastal settlements began building watchtowers and warning beacons, but these only gave people time to flee, not to mount effective resistance. Some Anglo-Saxon leaders tried to buy off the raiders. The first recorded payment, of what would later be called Darngeld, occurred in Kent in 865, when the people of Kent paid the Vikings to leave them alone. This established a dangerous precedent. Once Vikings learned they could extort payment through threats, raiding became even more profitable. Why risk battle when you could simply threaten violence and collect tribute? The psychological impact of these raids extended far beyond their immediate destruction. Churches across England began hiding their treasures, burying gold and silver that archaeologists still occasionally discover today. Monks started creating duplicate copies of important manuscripts and storing them in different locations. Some monasteries built defensive walls, fundamentally changing their character from open spiritual communities to fortified compounds. The raids also triggered a spiritual crisis. Anglo-Saxons believed that military victory came from God's favour. If pagans could defeat Christians, did that mean the Christian God was weaker than the Norse gods? Or was God punishing the English for their sins? This led to increased religious devotion, but also to doubt and fear. Some Anglo-Saxons may have wondered if they should appease the Norse gods as well as Christ. The Viking raids revealed fundamental weaknesses in Anglo-Saxon society. The kingdom's inability to cooperate against a common threat would have fatal consequences. Northumbria, weakened by civil war, could not defend its coasts. Mercia was focused on controlling other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rather than defending against external threats. Wessex was still building its power. Kent, Essex, and East Anglia were too small to mount effective defences alone. As the 9th century progressed, Viking raids became more frequent and ambitious. By the 830s, larger fleets were appearing. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a fleet of 35 ships attacking Carhampton in Somerset in 836. King Egbert of Wessex fought Vikings at Hingston Down in 838. These were no longer hit-and-run raids, but substantial military operations requiring organised response. The Vikings also began establishing temporary bases. In 850, for the first time, a Viking army wintered in England, camping on the island of Thanet in Kent. This marked a crucial shift from raiding to potential conquest. Wintering in England meant Vikings could raid year-round, maintaining constant pressure on Anglo-Saxon defences. It also suggested they were considering permanent settlement rather than just plunder. The nature of Viking forces was changing too. While early raids were conducted by independent groups, larger armies began forming under powerful leaders. These armies included warriors from across Scandinavia, not just single regions. They developed more sophisticated tactics, including the use of fortified camps and coordinated attacks on multiple targets. The Vikings were learning from their experiences and adapting their methods. The Anglo-Saxons slowly began adapting too. King Ethelwulf of Wessex won a major victory against Vikings at a clear in 851, showing that Viking armies could be defeated in open battle when Anglo-Saxons were properly prepared. Some regions began building fortified bridges to block river access. Coastal towns improved their defences. But these adaptations were local and uncoordinated, while Viking threats were becoming regional and organised. The early raids also established patterns that would persist throughout the Viking Age. Vikings preferred to attack during summer when sailing was easier, and armies could live off the land. They targeted wealth concentrations, whether in monasteries, markets, or royal estates. They used speed and mobility to avoid strong opposition. They exploited political divisions among their enemies, and they were perfectly willing to switch between raiding, trading, and extortion depending on circumstances. The impact on trade was complex. Viking raids disrupted some trading networks, making sea travel dangerous. But Vikings were also traders themselves, and they established new routes connecting England to Scandinavia and beyond. English slaves taken in raids appeared in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. English silver coins flowed to Scandinavia as plunder and tribute. This violent economic exchange would reshape both societies. Cultural exchange began even during this violent early period. Some captured Anglo-Saxons who survived slavery in Scandinavia eventually returned home, bringing knowledge of Norse language and customs. Vikings who settled temporarily in England learned about Anglo-Saxon agriculture, law, and religion. A few may have converted to Christianity, especially those who married local women or entered into alliance with Anglo-Saxon lords. By 860, Viking raiding had been a fact of English life for nearly 70 years. A generation had grown up knowing that any summer might bring longships and violence. The great monasteries of Northumbria were shadows of their former selves. Coastal settlements had shrunk or been abandoned. Fear of Vikings had become part of Anglo-Saxon culture, reflected in prayers, chronicles and poetry. But the worst was yet to come. The raids of the late 8th and early 9th centuries were just probing attacks, testing English defences and identifying weaknesses. The Vikings had learned that England was wealthy, divided and vulnerable. They had established bases, developed intelligence networks, and gained experience fighting Anglo-Saxon armies. The stage was set for a massive escalation. Instead of small raiding parties seeking quick plunder, England would soon face something far more dangerous: a great army bent on conquest. The year 865 marked a fundamental shift in the Viking relationship with England. No longer would Northmen come merely as raiders seeking treasure. Now they came as conquerors seeking kingdoms. The force that arrived that year was unlike anything England had seen before. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Great Heathen Army, and the name captured both its size and its terrifying pagan nature. This was not a raiding party of a few hundred warriors. Modern historians estimate it numbered between 3,000 and 5,000 fighting men, plus servants, slaves, and camp followers. For 9th century England, this was an enormous military force. The army was led by two brothers whose names would echo through history and legend. Ivar, called the Boneless, though no one knows exactly what that nickname meant. Perhaps he was incredibly flexible, or perhaps he suffered from a bone condition. His brother Halfdan was known for his ferocity in battle. Later sagas claimed they were sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, who had supposedly been executed by being thrown into a snake pit by King Ella of Northumbria. The brothers had come, the stories said, to avenge their father's death. Whether this was true or propaganda to justify conquest, it gave their invasion a personal dimension that resonated with the Norse emphasis on honour and revenge. The great army landed in East Anglia, but surprisingly, they did not immediately attack. Instead, they made peace with King Edmund of East Anglia, who provided them with horses and supplies. This was brilliant strategy. The Vikings needed time to organise and gather intelligence. They needed horses to transform themselves from a seaborne force to a land army capable of rapid movement. And they needed to keep East Anglia neutral while they attacked other kingdoms. Edmund probably thought he was buying safety for his realm. He was actually facilitating his own future destruction. With horses and supplies secured, the great army moved north in 866, heading for York, the capital of Northumbria. The timing was perfect. Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war between two rival kings, Ella and Osbert. The kingdom's forces were divided and weakened by internal conflict. York itself was poorly defended, its old Roman walls crumbling in places. The Vikings captured the city on November 1st, All Saints' Day, when many of the citizens were in church. The fall of York sent shockwaves across England. This was not some isolated monastery, but one of the most important cities in Britain, a former Roman capital and a major trading centre. The Vikings had proven they could take and hold major urban centres, not just raid and retreat. They spent the winter in York, fortifying it as their base of operations. From here, they could strike in any direction. The Northumbrian kings, Ella and Osbert, finally recognised the mortal threat they faced. They put aside their civil war and united their forces to recapture York. In March 867, they attacked the city with everything they had. The battle was catastrophic for the Northumbrians. Both kings were killed, along with much of the Northumbrian nobility. Some later stories claimed Ella was executed by the Blood Eagle, a gruesome ritual where the victim's ribs were cut from the spine and pulled out to form wings. Whether this actually happened or was later embellishment, it illustrated the terror the Vikings inspired. With both rival kings dead and their armies destroyed, Northumbria ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Vikings installed a puppet king named Egbert to rule on their behalf, but real power remained with the great army. Northumbria, once the most powerful and cultured of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had fallen in less than 2 years. Its great monasteries were destroyed or abandoned. Its schools and libraries, once the finest in Europe, were scattered. The golden age of Northumbrian Christianity and scholarship was over. The great army spent 867 consolidating their control over Northumbria and preparing for their next campaign. They were methodical conquerors, not random raiders. They built fortified camps, established supply lines, and gathered intelligence on their next targets. They also began something new for Vikings in England. Some warriors brought their families from Scandinavia and began settling on captured lands. This was no longer just about plunder. It was about creating a new Scandinavian kingdom in England. In late 867, the army moved south into Mercia, attacking Nottingham. Mercia was the most powerful remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdom, controlling most of central England. King Burgred of Mercia appealed for help to his brother-in-law, King Ethelred of Wessex. This was significant. For the first time, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were cooperating against the Viking threat. Ethelred brought the Wessex army north, and together the two kingdoms besieged the Vikings in Nottingham. But the Vikings refused to give battle. They stayed behind their fortifications, knowing that time was on their side. Medieval armies could only stay in the field for limited periods before supplies ran out, and warriors needed to return to their farms. Eventually, Burgred had to make peace with the Vikings, almost certainly paying them substantial tribute to leave Mercia. The great army withdrew to York for the winter, but they had demonstrated that even the combined forces of Mercia and Wessex could not dislodge them from a fortified position. In 869, the great army returned to East Anglia, the kingdom that had helped them 4 years earlier. King Edmund had perhaps hoped that his earlier cooperation would spare his kingdom. He was tragically wrong. The Vikings defeated Edmund's forces at Hoxne. Edmund himself was captured, and according to later accounts, executed when he refused to renounce Christianity. He was supposedly tied to a tree and shot full of arrows, then beheaded. Edmund would later be venerated as a martyr and saint, but his kingdom died with him. East Anglia became Viking territory. The pattern of conquest was now clear. The Vikings would identify a kingdom weakened by internal problems or previous attacks. They would strike fast, capture key strategic points, and fortify them. If faced with strong opposition, they would negotiate, take tribute, and withdraw temporarily. Then they would return when circumstances were more favourable. It was a patient, systematic approach to conquest that the Anglo-Saxons struggled to counter. By 870, the Great Army had destroyed 2 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and extracted tribute from a third. Only Wessex remained fully independent, and it was clearly next on the list. The army established a base at Reading, where the Thames and Kennet rivers meet. This gave them water access deep into Wessex while maintaining their connection to the sea. They fortified their position with earthworks and palisades, creating an almost impregnable base. King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother Alfred responded quickly. They attacked the Viking base at Reading but were repulsed with heavy losses. 4 days later, the armies met again at Ashdown on the Berkshire Downs. This battle would become legendary. According to later accounts, Alfred led the charge while his brother was still praying, showing the young prince's martial prowess. The West Saxons won a significant victory, killing 5 Viking jarls and many warriors. But the Vikings were far from defeated. 2 weeks later, they beat the West Saxons at Basing. More battles followed at Meerton and Wilton, with victories and defeats on both sides. The campaign of 871 saw 9 major battles, an intensity of warfare unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon history. In April, King Ethelred died, possibly from battle wounds. His brother Alfred succeeded him, becoming king in the middle of a desperate war for survival. The new King Alfred faced an impossible situation. His forces were exhausted from constant fighting. The Vikings controlled strategic positions throughout his kingdom. More Vikings were arriving from Scandinavia to join the successful army. Alfred had to make peace, paying tribute to get the Vikings to withdraw. It was humiliating, but necessary. Wessex needed time to recover and prepare. The great army moved to London, then controlled by Mercia, for the winter of 871-872. From there, they extracted more tribute from the Mercians. They then moved to Torksey in Lincolnshire, then to Repton in Derbyshire, systematically establishing control over Mercia. In 874, King Burgred of Mercia fled to Rome rather than continue fighting. The Vikings installed another puppet king, Ceolwulf, described contemptuously by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a foolish king's thane. At Repton, archaeologists have found extensive Viking remains, including a mass grave containing nearly 300 bodies. These were probably Vikings who died during the conquest of Mercia, showing that the Anglo-Saxons inflicted significant casualties even in defeat. The site also shows evidence of Viking winter camps, including workshops, defensive earthworks, and even a possible ritual site. The Great Army was not just fighting, it was establishing the infrastructure of conquest. In 874, something unexpected happened. The Great Army divided. Halfdan took part of the force north to consolidate control over Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says his men shared out the land and began ploughing and providing for themselves. This was the beginning of permanent Scandinavian settlement in northern England. Warriors became farmers, though they remained ready to fight when called. The other part of the army, led by Guthrum, Ossatel and Anwend, continued the war against Wessex. They established a base at Cambridge and launched raids deep into Wessex territory. In 876, they slipped past the Wessex army and seized Wareham in Dorset, then Exeter in Devon. Alfred was forced to chase them across his kingdom, unable to bring them to decisive battle. The Great Army's strategy had evolved from direct conquest to a war of attrition. They would seize fortified towns, extract tribute and supplies, and move on before Alfred could organise effective resistance. They were trying to exhaust Wessex, to make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of submission. It nearly worked. By 877, Alfred's kingdom was on the brink of collapse. The Vikings controlled strong points throughout Wessex. Alfred's army was worn down by years of campaigning. The treasury was empty from paying repeated tributes. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen or submitted. There seemed to be no hope of victory, only the choice between submission and destruction. Then, in January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack. Vikings seized Chippenham, where Alfred was spending Christmas. The king barely escaped with a small group of followers. Most of the Wessex nobility submitted to Guthrum or fled overseas. Alfred was reduced to hiding in the Somerset marshes at Athelney, a fugitive in his own kingdom. The last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom appeared to have fallen. England seemed destined to become a Scandinavian colony, but Alfred's darkest hour would become his turning point. Hidden in the marshes, he began gathering forces for a counterattack. Messages went out to loyal Thens across Wessex. Men who had hidden from the Vikings began emerging. The feared was secretly mobilised. After Easter 8708, Alfred emerged from Athelney with a new army, ready for one last desperate battle for the survival of Anglo-Saxon England. The great heathen army had achieved remarkable success in just 13 years. They had destroyed ancient kingdoms, killed kings, and transformed the political map of England. They had shown that Viking forces could not only raid but conquer and hold territory. They had introduced new forms of warfare to England, including winter campaigns, fortified camps, and mounted infantry tactics. They had begun the transformation of northern and eastern England into Scandinavian territory, but they had also awakened something in the Anglo-Saxons. The existential threat posed by the Great Army forced the English to think beyond petty kingdom rivalries. It created heroes and martyrs like Edmund of East Anglia. Most importantly, it produced Alfred, who had proved that the Vikings could be not just resisted but defeated. The stage was set for one of the most important battles in English history, a battle that would determine whether England would remain English or become Scandinavian. The Battle of Edington in May 878 changed everything. Alfred had emerged from the marshes with his gathered forces, meeting Guthrum's Viking army at Edington in Wiltshire. The details of the battle are frustratingly sparse in historical records, but we know it was decisive. The West Saxon forces, fighting for their very survival, broke the Viking shield wall. Guthrum's army fled back to their fortification at Chippenham, where Alfred besieged them for 2 weeks. Starving and defeated, the Vikings had no choice but to negotiate. The negotiations that followed were unlike any previous agreement between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. Alfred could have demanded simple withdrawal, as earlier kings had done. Instead, he demanded something unprecedented. Guthrum and his leading men must convert to Christianity. Alfred himself would stand as Guthrum's godfather at his baptism. This was not just about religion. It was about creating a framework for permanent peace between two peoples who would now have to share the island of Britain. The Treaty of Wedmore, as the agreement came to be known, fundamentally reshaped England. Alfred recognised that the Vikings could not be completely expelled. Too many had already settled in the north and east, bringing their families and establishing farms. Instead of endless war, Alfred proposed partition. The Vikings would keep the territories they had already conquered, roughly everything north and east of a line running from London to Chester. This territory would become known as the Danelaw, the place where Danish law ruled. Alfred would keep Wessex and the portions of Mercia not under Viking control. Guthrum, who took the Christian name Ethelstan at his baptism, became king of East Anglia. This was not a puppet kingdom like those the Vikings had established in Northumbria and Mercia, but a legitimate realm recognised by treaty. Guthrum issued coins bearing his Christian name, built churches, and ruled until his death in 890. The man who had nearly destroyed Anglo-Saxon England became, in effect, an Anglo-Saxon king himself. The creation of the Danelaw was more than just drawing lines on a map. It was the beginning of a massive cultural experiment. In the Danelaw, Scandinavian settlers had to figure out how to live permanently in a land very different from their homeland. They had to transform themselves from raiders and conquerors into farmers and townspeople. They had to develop new forms of government, mixing Norse traditions with existing Anglo-Saxon structures. They had to decide how much of their culture to preserve and how much to adapt. The settlement pattern in the Danelaw was not uniform. In some areas, particularly in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, Scandinavian settlement was dense. Entire districts became thoroughly Norse in character. Place names changed from Anglo-Saxon to Old Norse. Ripon became Ripon, Shipton became Skipton, and hundreds of new settlements were established with names ending in by meaning farm or village, and Thorpe meaning secondary settlement. These place names survive today, mapping out the intensity of Scandinavian settlement. In other areas, particularly in East Anglia and the 5 boroughs of Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Lincoln, and Stamford, Viking warriors formed a military aristocracy ruling over a largely Anglo-Saxon population. They took over existing estates and administrative structures, replacing Anglo-Saxon lords, but keeping many local customs and systems. This created a complex layered society, where Norse and English traditions mixed in different proportions. The legal system in the Danelaw blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon law in fascinating ways. The Vikings brought their tradition of things, public assemblies where free men could speak and vote on legal matters. These merged with Anglo-Saxon hundred courts to create new forms of local government. The Danelaw developed its own legal terminology. A wapentake replaced the Anglo-Saxon hundred as an administrative unit. Legal proceedings used Norse words and concepts unknown in English law. Land ownership in the Danelaw followed different patterns from English areas. Scandinavian settlers were more likely to own their land outright rather than holding it from a lord. This created a society with more independent farmers and fewer great estates. The Vikings divided land using a system called solskift, or sun division, where holdings were arranged in strips running from east to west to ensure everyone got some morning and afternoon sun. This practical approach to land division can still be seen in field patterns in parts of northern England. Trade flourished in the Danelaw. The Vikings were natural merchants, and they established or revitalised towns across their territory. York grew from a war-torn former capital into one of the largest cities in Britain, second only to London. It became a manufacturing centre, producing everything from jewellery to weapons. Archaeologists have found evidence of workshops producing items in distinctly Scandinavian styles alongside traditional Anglo-Saxon crafts. The five boroughs became important trading centres, connected by Roman roads that the Vikings maintained and improved. Lincoln developed a massive pottery industry. Leicester became known for its ironwork. These towns were fortified with new defences, often incorporating older Roman walls. They had planned streets, regulated markets, and sophisticated administrative systems. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were urban planners and administrators. The monetary system in the Danelaw showed how Vikings adapted to English conditions while maintaining their own traditions. They minted coins following English patterns, but with Norse designs and inscriptions. Some coins bore Thor's hammer alongside Christian crosses, showing the religious transition happening in Viking society. The extensive coin finds from this period show a monetized economy, with extensive trade networks reaching from Ireland to Russia. Religion in the Danelaw underwent gradual transformation. The first generation of settlers remained largely pagan, burying their dead with grave goods and maintaining Norse religious practices. But Christianity slowly gained ground. Some Vikings converted for political advantage, others through marriage to Christian women, and still others through genuine religious conviction. By the early 10th century, most Danelaw Vikings were at least nominally Christian, though they often practiced a syncretic religion mixing Christian and pagan elements. The Christian conversion of the Danelaw Vikings created unique religious art and architecture. Stone crosses from this period show fascinating combinations of Christian and pagan imagery. The Gosforth cross in Cumbria depicts both the crucifixion and scenes from Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. Churches were built in Scandinavian styles with distinctive round towers. Norse artistic traditions of intricate animal interlacing merged with Anglo-Saxon Christian art to create new forms. Language in the Danelaw became a complex mixture. Old Norse and Old English were similar enough that speakers could understand each other with effort, like modern Spanish and Italian speakers. Over time, the languages merged in the Danelaw, with Old Norse contributing hundreds of common words to English. Simple everyday words like knife, skill, window, husband, happy, and they came from Old Norse. The Norse also simplified English grammar, contributing to the loss of grammatical gender and complex word endings. The influence went beyond vocabulary. Norse speakers struggled with some English sounds and simplified them. The hard ski sound in Norse words like skip and skill contrasted with the softer sh sound that the same words had developed in English. In the Danelaw, both pronunciations existed side by side. Even English syntax was affected, with Norse word order patterns influencing Northern English dialects that persist today. Social structure in the Danelaw reflected Scandinavian egalitarian traditions modified by English conditions. The Vikings had a less rigid class system than the Anglo-Saxons. While they had slaves and lords, the middle class of free farmers, called bondi, had more rights and independence than their English counterparts. This created social mobility that was unusual in medieval Europe. A successful merchant or warrior could rise in status more easily in the Danelaw than in English territories. Women in the Danelaw had different rights and roles than in Anglo-Saxon England. Norse tradition gave women more independence, including the right to own land, conduct business, and divorce their husbands. Viking women could be merchants, managing trading expeditions while their husbands were away. Some archaeological finds suggest women warriors, though this remains controversial. The keys worn by Viking women as symbols of household authority became common in Danelaw burials. Marriage patterns in the Danelaw showed cultural blending. Many Viking men married Anglo-Saxon women, creating families that bridged both cultures. Children grew up bilingual and bicultural. DNA studies of modern British populations show extensive mixing between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations in former Danelaw areas. This was not just conquest, but genuine settlement and integration. Agricultural practices in the Danelaw combined Scandinavian and English techniques. The Vikings introduced new crops and farming methods from their homeland. They were particularly skilled at sheep farming, and the Danelaw became a major wool-producing region. They also brought advanced ironworking techniques that improved agricultural tools. The heavy mouldboard plough, which could turn the heavy clay soils of northern England, became more common in Viking areas. The military organisation of the Danelaw remained formidable. While many Vikings became farmers, they retained their warrior traditions. The Danelaw could mobilise substantial armies when threatened. These forces used Scandinavian tactics and weapons, but also adopted English innovations. The Danelaw armies were particularly skilled at rapid movement and fortification, legacies of their conquering past. Alfred the Great watched these developments with both concern and fascination. He recognised that the Danelaw represented both a threat and an opportunity. The Viking territories were potential enemies, but also trading partners. They were pagan influences, but also sources of new ideas and techniques. Alfred's response was to strengthen Wessex while learning from Viking innovations. Alfred reformed the West Saxon military, creating a standing army and a network of fortified towns called burhs. He built a navy to challenge Viking sea power, designing ships that were larger and more effective than Viking longships. He reformed the law, creating a code that drew on both Christian and Germanic traditions. He promoted education and literacy, personally translating important Latin texts into English. In many ways, Alfred was creating an Anglo-Saxon answer to the Viking challenge. The relationship between Wessex and the Danelaw in the late 9th century was complex. There were raids and conflicts, but also trade and communication. The boundary between the two regions was porous, with people, goods and ideas flowing both ways. English merchants traded in York and Lincoln. Viking merchants visited Winchester and London. Despite religious and cultural differences, economic interests created connections. The Danelaw was not politically unified. Northumbria, East Anglia, and the 5 boroughs often acted independently, sometimes even fighting each other. This disunity would eventually prove fatal to Viking independence, but in the late 9th century it reflected the decentralized nature of Scandinavian society. Each region had its own jarls and kings, its own laws and customs, its own relationships with English neighbours. By 890, when both Alfred and Guthrum died, the Danelaw had evolved from conquered territory into a distinct region with its own identity. It was no longer purely Scandinavian nor purely English, but something new. The Vikings who had arrived as destroyers had become builders. The raiders had become traders. The pagans were becoming Christians. The Danelaw was becoming English, but England was also becoming somewhat Scandinavian. This transformation was not complete or uniform. Tensions remained between Norse and English populations. Religious differences persisted despite widespread conversion. Legal disputes arose from conflicting traditions, but the Treaty of Wedmore had created a framework for coexistence that, despite many future conflicts, would never entirely break down. The Danelaw had been born, and with it, a new chapter in English history had begun. The death of Alfred the Great in 899 marked the beginning of a new phase in the relationship between the English and the Vikings. Alfred's son Edward, who took the throne of Wessex, inherited not just a kingdom, but a vision. His father had saved Wessex from conquest, but Edward would attempt something far more ambitious. Together with his sister Ethelfled, one of the most remarkable women in Anglo-Saxon history, he would begin the long process of conquering the Danelaw and creating a unified English kingdom. Edward, known to history as Edward the Elder, was a different kind of king from his father. Where Alfred had been a scholar warrior, Edward was primarily a soldier and administrator. He had grown up during the Viking Wars and understood military matters intimately. He also understood that the Danelaw could not be conquered in a single campaign. It would require patient, systematic pressure over many years. His sister Ethelfled had married Ethelred, the ruler of English Mercia, the part of that kingdom not under Viking control. When Ethelred became ill around 902, Ethelfled effectively took control. After his death in 911, she ruled in her own right as the Lady of the Mercians, a unique position in Anglo-Saxon history. She was not just a figurehead, but an active military commander who personally led armies and directed fortress construction. The partnership between Edward and Ethelfled was remarkably effective. They coordinated their campaigns, attacking the Danelaw from two directions simultaneously. While Edward pressed north from Wessex, Ethelfled struck from the west. The Vikings found themselves caught between two competent commanders who trusted each other completely. This kind of strategic cooperation was something the politically fragmented Danelaw struggled to match. The English strategy was methodical and intelligent. Rather than seeking dramatic battles, they focused on building fortified towns, called burhs, that projected power into Viking territory. Each burh was carefully positioned to control river crossings, road junctions, or economically important sites. They were not just military bases, but administrative centres where English law and governance could be established. As each burh was built and garrisoned, it became harder for Vikings to raid or move freely. Edward began his offensive in 909 with a devastating raid into Northumbria that reached as far as the Tyne. This was psychological warfare, showing the Vikings that they were no longer safe in their strongholds. When the Northumbrian Vikings retaliated by raiding Mercia, they were caught by a combined English force at Tettenhall in 910. The battle was a disaster for the Vikings. 3 kings were killed, along with many nobles. Northumbrian Viking power never fully recovered. The conquest of the Danelaw accelerated after Tettenhall. In 911, Ethelfled built a burh at Bridgenorth, threatening the Viking stronghold at Derby. Edward constructed burhs at Hertford, Witham and Malden, gradually encircling East Anglia. Each fortification required the Vikings to either attack it, allowing the English to fight from prepared positions, or accept the gradual erosion of their territory. The Vikings were not passive during this period. They launched numerous counterattacks and tried to maintain their independence. But they faced a fundamental problem. The very success of Viking settlement undermined their military effectiveness. Many Vikings were now farmers with crops to tend and families to protect. They could not simply abandon their lands for extended campaigns as their fathers had done. The wild raiders had become cautious property owners. In 908, the dam broke. Edward launched coordinated attacks that captured Colchester, Bedford, and Northampton in rapid succession. Aethelflaed took Derby, one of the 5 boroughs, without a fight. The following year, she captured Leicester and received the submission of York. The speed of the English advance was remarkable. Viking territories that had seemed permanent were falling like dominoes. The death of Aethelflaed in 918 was a severe blow to the English cause, but Edward quickly moved to prevent any fragmentation. He took direct control of Mercia, effectively ending its independence, but creating a unified English command. By 920, Edward had received the submission of all the Danelaw south of the Humber. The Viking kingdoms that had terrorized England for decades were now part of an expanding English state. But the situation in Northumbria remained complex. The Vikings of York were not ready to submit to English rule. Instead, they looked for help from an unexpected source, the Vikings of Dublin. The Irish Sea had become a Viking lake, with Norse kingdoms in Dublin, the Isle of Man, and the Scottish Islands. These sea kingdoms were closely connected to York through trade and kinship. When York needed a king to resist English expansion, they called on Ragnall, a successful Viking leader from Dublin. The arrival of the Dublin Vikings added a new dimension to the struggle for England. These were not settled farmers, but active raiders and traders with fleets and ambitions. They brought fresh energy to Viking resistance and connections to a wider Norse world. Under leaders like Ragnall and later Sihtric, York became the centre of a sea empire, stretching from Ireland to Northumbria. Edward's son Aethelstan, who became king in 924, faced this renewed Viking challenge. Aethelstan was perhaps the most capable of all Anglo-Saxon kings, combining military skill with diplomatic sophistication. He understood that conquering York required more than military force. It needed careful alliance building and patient pressure. Aethelstan's first move was diplomatic. He married his sister to Sihtric, the Viking king of York, in 926. When Sihtric died the following year, Aethelstan used this connection to claim authority over York. He drove out Sihtric's brother Guthfrith and became the first English king to rule all of England, including Northumbria. But this was just the beginning of a struggle that would continue for decades. The Vikings did not accept English rule passively. In 937, a grand coalition formed against Aethelstan. Olaf Guthfrithson from Dublin joined with Constantine of Scotland and Owen of Strathclyde in a massive invasion. The resulting Battle of Brunanburh was one of the largest battles in early medieval Britain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle devoted an unprecedented amount of space to describing the victory, calling it the greatest slaughter since the Anglo-Saxons first came to Britain. Brunanburh was more than just a military victory. It was a defining moment in the creation of English national identity. The poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of defending their land, their treasures, and their homes against foreign invaders. The Vikings, once conquerors, were now positioned as outsiders threatening an English nation. The conquered had become the conquerors. Yet Viking resilience was remarkable. After Aethelstan's death in 939, Olaf Guthfrithson returned and recaptured York. For the next 15 years, York changed hands repeatedly between English and Viking rulers. Eric Bloodaxe, the exiled king of Norway, ruled York twice in the 940s and 950s. His violent career and dramatic name embodied the continuing Viking warrior tradition, even as that tradition was fading elsewhere. The final English conquest of York in 954 marked the end of independent Viking kingdoms in England. Eric Bloodaxe was killed, possibly betrayed by his own supporters, who were tired of constant warfare. York was integrated into the English kingdom, and the last Viking kingdom in England ceased to exist. But this political conquest did not mean the end of Scandinavian influence in northern England. Throughout this period of conquest and reconquest, daily life in the former Danelaw continued with its unique blend of cultures. In York, English and Norse merchants traded side by side. Craftsmen produced goods that mixed Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian styles. Languages blended in the streets and markets. Even as kings fought for political control, ordinary people were creating a new hybrid culture. The legal integration of the Danelaw into England was complex and gradual. English kings were careful not to impose wholesale changes that might provoke rebellion. They confirmed many Danish customs and laws, creating a legal pluralism that lasted for generations. The Danelaw retained distinctive legal procedures, terminology, and concepts long after political independence ended. The Church played a crucial role in consolidating English control over the Danelaw. Archbishops of York, appointed by English kings, became powerful figures who helped integrate the north into the English kingdom. New monasteries were founded or refounded, becoming centres of English culture and administration. But the Church also adapted to local conditions, incorporating Scandinavian converts and their traditions. Economic integration proceeded faster than political unity. The Danelaw's towns were too valuable to isolate or destroy. York remained the second city of England, a vital commercial hub connecting England to Scandinavia and the Irish Sea. The five boroughs continued as important regional centres. English kings encouraged trade while establishing administrative control, understanding that prosperity would reconcile former Vikings to English rule. The military integration of the Danelaw created some of the most effective forces in medieval Europe. Former Viking warriors and their descendants served in English armies, bringing their skills and traditions. The Huscarls, elite household troops of later Anglo-Saxon kings, showed clear Scandinavian influence in their equipment and tactics. England's military strength in the 11th century owed much to this fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Viking traditions. By 960, the age of consolidation was largely complete. England was a unified kingdom from the Channel to the Scottish border. The Danelaw had been absorbed politically, but retained its distinctive character. Vikings had transformed from conquerors to subjects, but they had also transformed England in the process. The country that emerged from this consolidation was neither purely Anglo-Saxon nor Viking, but a new synthesis. This synthesis was visible everywhere. In language, where Norse words had become part of everyday English. In law, where Scandinavian concepts of justice influenced English practice. In place names, where thousands of Norse names marked the landscape. In DNA, where modern genetic studies show the extent of Scandinavian ancestry in northern and eastern England. The Vikings had been conquered, but they had also become English. The success of consolidation created new challenges. England was now wealthy and unified, making it an attractive target for new Viking raids. The administrative systems created to govern the former Danelaw would be tested by fresh Scandinavian invasions. The cultural mixing that had created a stronger England also created divisions that future invaders could exploit. The age of consolidation had ended one chapter of Viking England, but another was about to begin. The year 980 marked a disturbing return to England's past. After a generation of peace, Viking longships once again appeared off the English coast. But these were not settlers seeking land or conquerors seeking kingdoms. These were raiders in the old style, seeking silver and slaves. The second Viking age had begun, and it would prove even more traumatic than the first. The initial raids were small, testing English defences. Southampton was attacked in 980, followed by Cheshire and Devon. These Vikings came from Norway and Denmark, where new political conditions had created fresh waves of raiders. In Norway, King Harald Bluetooth was consolidating power, driving defeated rivals to seek fortune abroad. In Denmark, population growth and political ambition created pressure for expansion. The wealthy, unified England created by Edward and Ethelstan was an irresistible target. The English response to these new raids was shockingly ineffective. King Ethelred, who had come to the throne as a child in 978, lacked the military experience and decisive character of his predecessors. His nickname, the Unready, actually meant poorly advised, but it came to symbolize his entire ineffective reign. Where Alfred had fought and Edward had conquered, Ethelred hesitated and paid. The Battle of Malden in 991 epitomized the problems facing England. A Viking force led by Olaf Tryggvason, future King of Norway, was confronted by Byrhtnoth, Ealdorman of Essex. In an act of aristocratic pride that would have fatal consequences, Byrhtnoth allowed the Vikings to cross a causeway and form up for battle rather than keeping them trapped. The English were defeated and Byrhtnoth was killed. The battle became famous through an Old English poem that celebrated heroic defeat rather than strategic wisdom. After Malden, Ethelred made a fateful decision. Rather than continue fighting, he would pay the Vikings to leave. The first payment was £10,000 of silver, an enormous sum. This Danegeld, as it came to be known, was supposed to buy peace. Instead, it advertised England's wealth and weakness. Every payment brought more Vikings seeking their share of English silver. The raids of the 990s grew progressively worse. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason joined forces with Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, to attack London with 94 ships. Though London held out, the surrounding countryside was devastated. Ethelred paid £16,000 of silver for them to leave. In 997, Vikings raided Cornwall, Wales, Devon and Somerset. In 998, they attacked Dorset and Hampshire. In 999, they raided Kent. England was being systematically plundered. The psychological impact of these raids was devastating. The English had thought the Viking threat was over. They had built a unified kingdom and converted the Scandinavian settlers. Now they faced a new generation of Vikings who seemed unstoppable. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle for these years is full of despair. They did as they were wont to do. They harried and burned and slew as they went, wrote the chronicler about one raid. Ethelred's government tried various strategies, all unsuccessful. They paid more Danegeld, reaching a staggering sum of £24,000 in 1002. They tried to buy off individual Viking leaders, making Olaf Tryggvason promise never to return to England. They attempted to build a navy, but it was poorly organised and achieved nothing. They ordered prayers and fasting, hoping God would deliver them from the Viking scourge. Then, in November 1002, Ethelred made his most catastrophic decision. He ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England. This St. Brice's Day massacre, as it became known, was both morally appalling and strategically stupid. It was impossible to kill all Danes in England. Many had been settled for generations and were indistinguishable from the English. But in some towns, particularly Oxford, there were terrible scenes of murder. Danes were burned alive in churches where they had sought sanctuary. Among the victims of the massacre was Gunhild, sister of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark. Whether her death was intentional or accidental, it gave Sweyn a personal motive for revenge to add to his political ambitions. The massacre also horrified the Scandinavian settlers in the Danelaw, undermining their loyalty to the English crown. Ethelred had created the perfect justification for invasion while weakening his own support. Sweyn's response was swift and terrible. In 1003 he arrived with a massive fleet and army. This was not a raid but a campaign of conquest and punishment. Exeter was captured and destroyed. Wilton was burned. Salisbury was sacked. The Viking army moved through Wessex like a plague, destroying everything in its path. Ethelred's forces were unable or unwilling to fight. The king paid £36,000 of silver for Sweyn to leave, but everyone knew he would return. The years 1006 to 1012 saw England subjected to almost continuous Viking attacks. A huge army, led by Thorkel the High, devastated southern England. Canterbury, the religious capital of England, was captured in 1011. Archbishop Elfheard was taken prisoner and murdered when he refused to allow ransom to be paid for him. The Vikings pelted him with bones and ox heads at a drunken feast, and then one Viking finished him with an axe blow. The murder of the archbishop shocked Christian Europe and showed that this new generation of Vikings could be as savage as their ancestors. Ethelred's response to the crisis was to hire Vikings to fight Vikings. He took Thorkel the High into his service with 45 ships and their crews, paying them with yet more Danegeld. This created the paradoxical situation where English taxes were paying Vikings to defend against other Vikings. It also brought thousands of Scandinavian warriors into England as mercenaries, further militarising society. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard returned for the final conquest. This time, he had learned from previous Viking failures. Instead of attacking Wessex first, he landed in the north, in the Danelaw where Scandinavian sympathy was strongest. Northumbria immediately submitted to him, followed by Lindsey and the Five Boroughs. The descendants of Viking settlers saw Sweyn as a liberator from Ethelred's incompetent rule. Sweyn then marched south, receiving the submission of Oxford and Winchester without a fight. London held out briefly, defended by Ethelred and Thorkel's Vikings, but when the rest of England submitted, resistance became pointless. Ethelred fled to Normandy, where his wife Emma was from. On Christmas Day, 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was recognised as King of England. The Viking conquest was complete, but Sweyn's triumph was short-lived. He died suddenly on February 3rd, 1014, after ruling for only 5 weeks. His son Knut was with the fleet in Denmark and could not immediately take control. The English nobles, perhaps feeling buyer's remorse about accepting a foreign conqueror, invited Ethelred back from Normandy. The returning king promised to rule better, a promise he immediately broke. Knut returned in 1015 with a large army, beginning a brutal campaign to claim what he saw as his inheritance. The fighting was complicated by divisions within the English nobility. Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's son, emerged as an effective military leader, winning several battles against Knut. But when Ethelred died in April 1016, the succession was disputed. London chose Edmund as king, but many nobles preferred Knut. The war between Edmund and Knut was fierce but brief. They fought multiple battles across England in 1016. Edmund showed the military capability that his father had lacked, matching Knut victory for victory. The decisive battle at Asundun in October saw Knut victorious, possibly due to treachery by the English noble Edric Striona. Shortly after, Edmund and Knut met and agreed to divide England, with Edmund keeping Wessex and Knut taking everything north of the Thames. This division might have created another period of dual kingdoms, but Edmund died suddenly in November 1016, possibly assassinated. Knut became king of all England at the age of about 22. The Second Viking Age had culminated in something unprecedented, a Scandinavian king ruling a unified England, not as a conqueror imposing foreign rule, but as a legitimate monarch accepted by the English nobility. Knut's coronation as King of all England in 1017 marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable reigns in English history. Here was a Viking conqueror who would become more English than many native kings, while simultaneously ruling an empire that spanned the North Sea. His reign would prove that Vikings and English could not just coexist, but thrive together, under capable leadership. The young king's first actions showed both ruthlessness and wisdom. He executed or exiled several English nobles who had opposed him or might threaten his rule. Edric Striona, who had betrayed Edmund Ironside, was killed, Cnut reportedly saying that a man who betrayed one master might betray another. But Cnut also showed mercy and pragmatism. He confirmed many English nobles in their positions, understanding that he needed their cooperation to rule effectively. One of Cnut's most brilliant moves was his marriage to Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow. This was not a love match, but a political masterstroke. Emma was connected to both English and Norman nobility. By marrying her, Cnut gained legitimacy and prevented Ethelred's sons in Normandy from using their mother's claim to challenge his rule. Emma, for her part, remained queen and gained a capable protector for her interests. Cnut divided England into 4 great earldoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. He kept Wessex, the richest and most important, for himself. The others he gave to trusted supporters, both English and Scandinavian. This system provided strong regional government while preventing any single earl from becoming too powerful. It was a more centralised system than the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but more flexible than direct royal control. The new king faced an immediate challenge in maintaining his army. The force that had conquered England expected rewards. Cnut's solution was elegant. In 1018, he collected an enormous Danegeld of £82,000 of silver, the largest ever raised. He used this to pay off most of his army and send them home. Only 40 ships and their crews remained as a standing force. England had essentially paid for its own conquest, but it also gained peace. Cnut's transformation from Viking conqueror to English king was deliberate and thorough. He issued laws that combined English and Danish traditions, presenting himself as the heir to Edgar and other great Anglo-Saxon kings. He promoted English customs and protected English churches. He appointed English bishops and abbots. Most remarkably, in 1027 he made a pilgrimage to Rome, presenting himself as a Christian king seeking divine approval. The letter Cnut sent back from Rome to his English subjects reveals his conception of kingship. He wrote of negotiating with the Pope and Emperor to reduce tolls on English pilgrims and traders. He promised to rule justly and protect the Church. He acknowledged his youthful wrongdoings and promised amendment. This was not a barbarian warlord, but a sophisticated monarch who understood both the practical and symbolic aspects of power. In 1018, Cnut's brother Harold died, making Cnut king of Denmark as well as England. This created a unique situation. England was now part of a Scandinavian empire, but it was the richest and most important part. English wealth funded Danish defences against Norway and Sweden. English administrative expertise helped govern Danish territories. The North Sea had become a Danish lake, with Cnut's ships controlling the vital trade routes. The empire expanded further in 1028 when Cnut conquered Norway. He had been undermining Norwegian independence for years, bribing nobles and supporting rivals to King Olaf Haraldsson. When Olaf was driven into exile, Cnut sailed to Norway with 50 ships and was accepted as king without major resistance. He now ruled 3 kingdoms spanning from the Irish Sea to the Baltic. Managing this empire required constant movement and careful delegation. Cnut spent roughly equal time in England and Denmark, with occasional visits to Norway. He appointed strong regents, including his English wife Emma and his Danish son Harthacnut. He maintained separate administrative systems for each kingdom while using their resources to support each other. It was a personal union held together by Cnut's energy and ability. The economic benefits of the empire were substantial. Trade flourished without the disruption of Viking raids. English wool and grain flowed to Scandinavia. Scandinavian furs, amber and timber came to England. The standardization of coinage and weights across the empire facilitated commerce. Cities like London, York and Copenhagen grew wealthy from this trade. Cnut's empire was not just a military achievement, but an economic success. Culturally, Cnut's reign saw remarkable flowering. The king patronised both English and Scandinavian artists and poets. Skalds from Iceland and Norway came to his court, composing elaborate praise poems in Old Norse. English monks produced illuminated manuscripts and historical chronicles. The fusion of traditions created new art forms. Churches built during this period show architectural influences from both England and Scandinavia. The court itself became truly international. English nobles learned Old Norse to communicate with Danish colleagues. Danish warriors adopted English customs and clothing. Intermarriage between English and Danish families became common at all social levels. Children grew up bilingual and bicultural. The ethnic divisions that had defined the Viking Age began to blur into something new. Cnut's law codes show how he balanced different traditions. He confirmed the laws of Edgar and other respected Anglo-Saxon kings while incorporating Danish legal concepts. His laws protected the weak, regulated trade and established uniform procedures across England. They were written in English, not Latin or Danish, showing his commitment to English governance. These laws would influence English legal development long after the Danish Empire collapsed. The church under Cnut experienced a golden age. The king was genuinely pious, or at least understood the political value of piety. He rebuilt churches destroyed during the conquest. He made generous donations to monasteries. He promoted learned clergy and supported religious reform. The church, in return, legitimized his rule and helped administer his realm. Bishops became royal advisors and regional governors. One of Cnut's most famous acts was his demonstration at the seashore, where he commanded the tide to stop and, when it did not, proclaimed that only God had true power. This story, often misunderstood as showing arrogance, actually demonstrated humility. Cnut was teaching his flattering courtiers that earthly power had limits. It showed a sophisticated understanding of Christian kingship that impressed both English and Danish subjects. The military organisation of Cnut's empire was innovative. He maintained a small but professional standing force, the Huskarls, who served as both bodyguards and elite troops. These were mostly Scandinavian warriors, but English fighters could join if they proved themselves. The Huskarls were paid regular wages and followed a strict code of conduct. They provided the core around which larger armies could be assembled when needed. Naval power was crucial to Cnut's empire. He maintained a fleet of perhaps 60 longships, crewed by professional sailors and warriors. These ships could move quickly between his kingdoms, carrying messages, troops, or trade goods. The fleet prevented any rival from challenging Cnut's control of the North Sea. It also protected merchant shipping, encouraging trade and generating customs revenue. Women played important roles in Cnut's empire. Queen Emma was not just a ceremonial figure, but an active ruler who governed in Cnut's absence. She had her own lands, her own court, and her own political agenda. Other noble women managed estates, arranged marriages that bound English and Danish families together, and patronised churches and artists. The relative freedom of Scandinavian women influenced English society. The economy under Cnut was remarkably sophisticated. England had the most advanced monetary system in Northern Europe, with standardised silver pennies minted at dozens of locations. Cnut maintained this system while extending it to his other kingdoms. He regulated weights and measures, protected merchants, and punished counterfeiters. The extensive coin finds from his reign show a monetised economy with widespread trade. Urban development accelerated under Cnut. Towns were centres of royal power, providing taxes and soldiers. Cnut encouraged urban growth through privileges and protection. London became one of the largest cities in Northern Europe. York recovered from earlier devastation to become a major commercial hub. New towns were founded at strategic locations. Urban craftsmen produced goods that blended English and Scandinavian styles. The international connections of Cnut's empire were extensive. He corresponded with the German Emperor and the Pope. English and Danish merchants traded from Iceland to Constantinople. Diplomatic marriages linked his family to Poland, Normandy, and other powers. England, long isolated on the edge of Europe, became central to northern European politics. But Knut's empire had fundamental weaknesses. It was held together by personal loyalty to Knut himself rather than institutional structures. The three kingdoms maintained separate identities and interests. Norway, in particular, resented Danish rule and remembered its independence. When Knut died in 1035, these weaknesses would quickly become apparent. Knut's death at Shaftesbury revealed the fragility of his achievement. He had intended his empire to be divided among his sons, but succession disputes immediately arose. Harthacnut was in Denmark when his father died and could not immediately claim England. Harald Harefoot, Knut's son by his first wife Elfgifu, seized power in England despite questionable legitimacy. Emma and the powerful Earl Godwin initially supported Harthacnut, but had to accept Harold as regent, then king. The division of the empire happened almost immediately. Norway had already rejected Danish rule in 1034, bringing back Olaf Haraldsson's son Magnus. Denmark was threatened by Norway and needed Harthacnut's full attention. England under Harald Harefoot drifted away from Scandinavian affairs. The North Sea Empire, which had seemed so powerful, dissolved within years of its creator's death. Harald Harefoot's reign from 1035 to 1040 was undistinguished and controversial. He may have been responsible for the murder of Alfred Etheling, one of Emma's sons by Ethelred, who had returned from Normandy seeking the throne. When Harold died in 1040, Harthacnut arrived from Denmark to claim the English throne, but his reign was even worse, marked by heavy taxation and harsh rule. When he died suddenly in 1042 while drinking at a wedding feast, few mourned. The English nobility's choice of Edward, later called the Confessor, as king in 1042 marked the end of Danish rule. Edward was the son of Ethelred and Emma, representing the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. His accession was presented as a restoration, a return to legitimate English kingship after the Danish interlude. But this was largely propaganda. England had been fundamentally changed by its incorporation into Knut's empire. The legacy of Knut's reign was complex and lasting. Politically, it showed that England could be successfully ruled by a foreign king if he respected English traditions. Economically, it integrated England into Scandinavian trade networks that continued long after political separation. Culturally, it completed the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions that had begun with the Danelaw settlements. The administrative innovations of Knut's reign persisted under his successors. The earldom system he created would continue until the Norman conquest. The legal reforms he initiated influenced later English law. The naval organisation he developed became the basis for English sea power. Even the Huscarls continued as an elite military force under Edward the Confessor. Perhaps most importantly, Knut's reign demonstrated that the Viking Age was ending. He was a Viking who became a European monarch, more interested in stable rule than raiding. His empire was based on trade and administration rather than plunder. He showed that Scandinavians could be sophisticated rulers, not just warriors. This transformation of Viking culture would continue in Normandy, Sicily, and elsewhere. Edward the Confessor's accession to the English throne in 1042 seemed to mark the end of the Viking Age in England. Here was a king of the ancient West Saxon line, son of Ethelred the Unready, restored after decades of Danish rule. But Edward's reign would prove that England could never simply return to its pre-Viking past. The Scandinavian influence was now too deeply embedded in English society, and the Viking threat, though diminished, had not entirely disappeared. Edward himself embodied the complexity of 11th century England. Though Anglo-Saxon by blood, he had spent 25 years in exile in Normandy, where his mother Emma had fled during Swine Forkbeard's conquest. He spoke French as easily as English and brought Norman friends and customs to the English court. His piety, which earned him his nickname, the Confessor, and eventual sainthood, was more continental than English in style. He was an English king who seemed foreign to many of his subjects. The power structure Edward inherited was dominated by men who had risen under Snut. The most powerful was Godwin, Earl of Wessex, an English nobleman who had collaborated with the Danish regime and been richly rewarded. Godwin had married a Danish noblewoman, and his children bore Scandinavian names like Sweyn, Harold, and Tostig. He controlled vast estates across southern England and commanded the loyalty of many lesser nobles. Edward needed Godwin's support but resented his power. The early years of Edward's reign saw continued Scandinavian influence at court. Many of Canut's Danish supporters retained their positions. The Huscarls continued as the elite royal guard. Danish merchants maintained their trading privileges. The church hierarchy included many who had been appointed under Danish rule. Edward could not and did not attempt a wholesale purge of Danish influence. But the Viking world had not forgotten England's wealth. In 1045, Magnus of Norway, who had expelled the Danes from his kingdom, considered invading England. He claimed to have inherited Knut's English throne through a treaty with Harthacnut. Only Magnus's death in 1047 prevented another major Viking invasion. His successor, Harold Hardrada, would also covet the English throne, biding his time for the right moment to strike. The tension between Edward and Godwin exploded in 1051. A violent incident in Dover involving the king's Norman friends led to a confrontation. Godwin refused the king's order to punish Dover, and Edward, supported by other earls jealous of Godwin's power, forced him into exile. For a brief moment, it seemed Edward might free himself from the Anglo-Danish nobility that constrained him. He appointed Normans to key positions and may have promised the English throne to Duke William of Normandy. But Godwin's exile proved temporary. In 1052 he returned with a fleet, gathering support from the south coast. His son Harold raised forces in Ireland, showing the continuing importance of Irish-Scandinavian connections. Faced with potential civil war, Edward capitulated. Godwin was restored to power. The Norman appointees fled, and the Anglo-Danish nobility reasserted control. The incident showed that the structures created during the Danish period were now fundamental to English governance. When Godwin died in 1053, his son Harold succeeded as Earl of Wessex. Harold Godwinson was a remarkable figure who embodied the Anglo-Scandinavian fusion that characterised late Anglo-Saxon England. He was English by birth, but Danish in many of his connections and methods. He was a capable military commander who fought successful campaigns in Wales. He was also a skilled diplomat who travelled to Normandy and possibly Scandinavia. By the 1060s, Harold was effectively ruling England, while Edward focused on building Westminster Abbey. The north of England remained particularly Scandinavian in character. Northumbria was ruled by Earl Siward, a Dane who had arrived during Canut's reign. When Siward died in 1055, he was succeeded by Tostig, Harold Godwinson's brother, but Tostig's harsh rule provoked rebellion in 1065. The Northumbrians demanded a Danish earl, Morcar, showing their continuing preference for Scandinavian-connected leadership. Harold Godwinson supported the rebels against his own brother, prioritising political stability over family loyalty. Throughout Edward's reign, England maintained close connections with Scandinavia. English merchants traded in Danish and Norwegian ports. Scandinavian merchants were prominent in London and York. English coins circulated widely in Scandinavia, and Scandinavian styles influenced English art and craftsmanship. The North Sea remained an integrated economic zone despite political separation. The church under Edward showed interesting Scandinavian influences. While the king promoted continental reforms and Latin learning, many English churches retained practices influenced by decades of Danish rule. The cult of Saint Olaf of Norway became popular in England. Churches were dedicated to Scandinavian saints. Some liturgical practices showed Norse influence. The English church was Catholic but with distinctive features shaped by the Viking Age. Military organisation retained strong Scandinavian elements. The huscarls remained the elite force now serving English kings, but maintaining Danish traditions. They used Danish-style axes and fighting techniques. The English navy, though smaller than under Canute, followed Scandinavian designs and methods. When England needed to defend itself, it used military systems largely created during the Danish period. As Edward's reign progressed, the succession question became critical. The king had no children, possibly due to a vow of celibacy. Various candidates had claims to the throne. Edgar Atheling was the closest male relative of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, but was young and lacked support. William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the throne, but the strongest candidate was Harold Godwinson, who controlled the government and had the support of the nobility. The year 1066 began with Edward's death on January 5th. Harold Godwinson was crowned king the next day, moving quickly to forestall challenges, but his claim was immediately contested. William of Normandy began preparing an invasion fleet. More ominously for Harold, Harald Hardrada of Norway also claimed the English throne. The Norwegian king's claim was based on the agreement between Magnus and Harthacnut, but it was really justified by strength and ambition. Harald Hardrada was the last great Viking warrior king. He had spent his youth as a mercenary in Russia and Byzantine service, fighting from Sicily to Jerusalem. He had returned to claim the Norwegian throne in 1046 and spent 20 years consolidating his power. Now in his 50s, he saw the disputed English succession as his chance to recreate Knut's North Sea Empire. His invasion would be the last great Viking attack on England. Hardrada's preparations were thorough. He gathered a fleet of perhaps 300 ships and an army of 9,000 warriors. He secured the support of Tostig Godwinson, who wanted revenge for losing his earldom. He timed his invasion for September, when Harold Godwinson would be watching the south coast for William's invasion. The strategy nearly worked. The Norwegian fleet sailed to the Orkney and Shetland Islands, gathering reinforcements from these Norse territories. They then sailed down the Scottish coast and up the Humber River, penetrating deep into northern England. On September 20th, at Fulford near York, Hardrada's forces met and defeated the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. York, the ancient Viking capital, surrendered once again to a Scandinavian conqueror. Harold Godwinson's response was remarkable. He was in southern England, watching for William's invasion, when news of the Norwegian landing reached him. In one of the great forced marches of medieval history, Harold led his army north, covering 200 miles in 4 days. He arrived at York before Hardrada expected any response from the south. On September 25th, 1066, the English and Norwegian armies met at Stamford Bridge, about 7 miles east of York. The battle was a complete English victory. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson were killed. The Norwegian army was destroyed so thoroughly that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors home. The last great Viking invasion of England had failed catastrophically, but Harold Godwinson had no time to celebrate. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed in southern England. Harold had to march his exhausted army south for another decisive battle. On October 14th at Hastings, the English army was defeated and Harold was killed. William the Conqueror became King of England, beginning the Norman period of English history. The irony was profound. William was himself descended from Vikings. His ancestor, Rollo, had been a Norwegian Viking who conquered northern France in the early 10th century. The Normans were essentially Frenchified Vikings who retained much of their ancestors' military prowess and ambition. England had defeated the last traditional Viking invasion only to fall to a different kind of Viking conquest. The Battle of Stamford Bridge is traditionally seen as the end of the Viking Age. It marked the last attempt by a Scandinavian king to conquer England by force. The age of Viking raids and invasions that had begun at Lindisfarne in 793 ended at a bridge in Yorkshire in 1066. But this neat ending obscures the continuing Scandinavian influence on England. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 is often presented as the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Anglo-Saxon period was over, the Norman period had begun, but this clean division obscures a fundamental truth. The Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings, and their conquest of England was, in many ways, the final act of the Viking Age, rather than something entirely separate. The story of Norman origins begins with a Viking named Rollo, or Hrolf in Old Norse. In 911, the same year that Edward the Elder and Ethelfled were building burhs against Danish Vikings in England, Rollo was receiving a grant of land from Charles the Simple, King of France. The French had suffered from Viking raids just as the English had, and Charles's solution was similar to Alfred's Treaty of Wedmore. He would give the Vikings land in exchange for peace and military service. The territory granted to Rollo centred on Rouen and the lower Seine Valley. It became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Like the Danelaw in England, it was a region where Scandinavian settlers would adapt to local conditions while maintaining their own traditions. But the Norman adaptation to French culture was more thorough and rapid than the Danish integration in England. Within 2 generations, the Normans had adopted French language, though Old Norse words survived in Norman French, especially maritime and military terms. They embraced French feudalism, but with a more centralised authority that reflected Scandinavian traditions of strong leadership. They became Christian, but their church retained a practical military character different from French spirituality. They were French in form, but Viking in spirit. The Normans retained the Viking wanderlust and military prowess. Norman adventurers conquered southern Italy and Sicily from the Arabs and Byzantines. They participated enthusiastically in the Crusades. They were always ready for war and conquest, viewing it as both profitable and honourable. This combination of French sophistication and Viking aggression made them formidable. William himself embodied these Norman characteristics. He was descended from Rollo through 6 generations of increasingly Frenchified, but still recognisably Viking rulers. His illegitimate birth, as William the Bastard, meant he had to fight for everything he achieved. He survived assassination attempts, rebellions, and invasions to become one of the most powerful rulers in France. He was cultured enough to patronise churches and brutal enough to devastate entire regions. When William invaded England in 1066, he brought an army that was Viking in its core military traditions, but French in its organisation and tactics. The Norman cavalry charge that won at Hastings was a French innovation, but the ferocity and discipline of the warriors reflected their Viking heritage. The castle-building programme that secured Norman rule combined French architectural knowledge with Viking strategic thinking. The Norman conquest created a fascinating situation in England. The country now had 3 layers of Viking influence. First, there were the descendants of the original Danelaw settlers, thoroughly integrated into English society, but retaining distinctive customs and names. Second, there were the Anglo-Danish nobles who had risen under Nut and maintained power under Edward the Confessor. Third, there were the new Norman rulers, French-speaking Vikings who saw themselves as entirely different from their Scandinavian cousins. These 3 groups interacted in complex ways. Some Anglo-Danish nobles initially resisted Norman rule, but later collaborated. The Danelaw regions that had welcomed Viking invaders for generations showed less enthusiasm for Norman conquerors who spoke French rather than Norse. The Normans themselves were sometimes able to use their distant Viking heritage to claim legitimacy, while at other times they emphasized their French culture to distance themselves from barbarous Scandinavians. The linguistic impact of the Norman conquest added another layer to England's already complex language situation. Old English had already absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words from the Danelaw settlements. Now, Norman French became the language of governments and high culture. The result was a unique triple fusion. Modern English vocabulary is roughly 30% French, 5% Norse, and 30% Old English, with the remainder from Latin and other sources. Many of our paired words for the same concept reflect this history. The Anglo-Saxon sheep becomes the Norman French mutton when served at table. The Norse skill exists alongside the French ability. The Old English freedom parallels the French liberty. This linguistic richness, frustrating to those learning English, is the direct result of successive waves of Viking influence. The Normans initially treated England as conquered territory to be exploited. They replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility almost entirely. They built castles to control the population. They extracted wealth through harsh taxation. The Domesday Book of 1086, William's great survey of English resources, was essentially a conqueror's inventory of his plunder. This was Viking behaviour dressed in French administrative efficiency. But like earlier Viking conquerors, the Normans gradually became English. They needed English cooperation to rule effectively. They married English women, and their children grew up hearing English from their mothers and nurses. They adopted English administrative practices that were more sophisticated than Norman ones. By the 12th century, many Norman nobles thought of themselves as English, though French-speaking English. The Norman conquest also reconnected England to Scandinavia in unexpected ways. When William faced rebellions in northern England, the rebels often sought help from Denmark. King Svein Estridsson of Denmark, Canute's nephew, sent fleets to England in 1069 and 1070 to support English resistance. These expeditions failed, but they showed that Scandinavia had not forgotten its claims to England. The most serious Danish threat came in 1085 when Knut IV of Denmark prepared a massive invasion fleet. William took the threat seriously enough to bring a huge army of mercenaries to England and to devastate the coastal areas where the Danes might land. The invasion never materialised due to rebellion in Denmark, but the threat influenced William's decision to compile the Domesday Book to better understand and control English resources. The Norman period saw the final integration of Scandinavian settlers into English society. The distinctive legal customs of the Danelaw gradually disappeared, replaced by Norman law. Scandinavian names became less common as families adopted Norman French names to curry favour with the new rulers. The Norse language disappeared from England, surviving only in dialects and place names. Yet Viking influence persisted in subtle ways. The independent spirit of the Danelaw regions manifested in resistance to royal authority throughout the medieval period. The tradition of local assemblies and participatory government, strengthened by Scandinavian Thing traditions, influenced the development of English parliamentary democracy. The maritime traditions of the Vikings contributed to England's later emergence as a naval power. Archaeological evidence reveals the lasting Viking impact on England. Scandinavian DNA is found throughout the former Danelaw, with some regions showing 10 to 15% Scandinavian ancestry. Place names tell the story of settlement. Over 1,000 English place names are definitely Scandinavian, with hundreds more showing Norse influence. The street patterns of York, Lincoln, and other Danelaw towns still follow Viking Age layouts. The Viking impact on English culture extended beyond language and genetics. The Norse tradition of saga storytelling influenced English literature. The warrior ethos of the Vikings shaped English concepts of honour and courage. The Norse emphasis on law and legal procedure contributed to English common law traditions. Even English folklore shows Viking influence, with Norse gods and heroes transformed into English folk tales. Trade patterns established during the Viking Age persisted long after political connections ended. English wool continued to flow to Scandinavia. Scandinavian timber and furs came to England. The North Sea remained an integrated economic zone, with merchants maintaining connections regardless of political changes. These trade networks would later contribute to the Hanseatic League and the commercial revolution of the later Middle Ages. The military legacy of the Vikings shaped English warfare for centuries. The Huskarl tradition influenced the development of professional soldiers. Viking ship designs influenced English naval architecture. The castle building techniques the Normans brought were ultimately derived from Viking fortification methods. Even the longbow, the weapon that would make English armies famous, was possibly influenced by Viking archery traditions. Religious practice in England retained Viking influences despite official Christianity. St. Olaf remained popular, especially in the north. Churches in former Danelaw areas often had distinctive architectural features reflecting Scandinavian traditions. Some pagan practices survived as folk customs, especially those related to seasonal celebrations. The practical, less mystical approach to Christianity that characterized Norse converts influenced English religious attitudes. The Viking Age also left psychological marks on English culture. The trauma of Viking raids created a fear of invasion that influenced English policy for centuries. The success of Viking settlers demonstrated that England could absorb and transform foreign peoples. The experience of being conquered, first by Danes then by Normans, created a complex relationship with authority and resistance that shaped English political development. By the end of the 11th century, the direct Viking impact on England was ending. The Normans were becoming English. The Scandinavian settlers were fully integrated. Denmark and Norway were becoming European kingdoms more interested in Baltic expansion than English adventures. But the Viking legacy was permanently embedded in English society, language, culture, and genetics. The Vikings who settled in England didn't just bring weapons and longships. They brought an entire way of life that would blend with Anglo-Saxon culture to create something entirely new. In the streets of York, the fields of Lincolnshire, and the markets of London, Norse and English traditions mixed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first terrifying raids. This cultural fusion happened not through royal decrees or treaties, but through the daily interactions of ordinary people living side by side. In the Danelaw towns, the mixing of cultures was most visible. York, which the Vikings called Jorvik, became a showcase of Anglo-Scandinavian urban life. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate have revealed an incredibly detailed picture of daily life in Viking Age York. The streets were narrow and crowded, lined with wooden buildings that served as both workshops and homes. Craftsmen worked in the front rooms, visible to passers-by, while families lived in the back rooms and upper floors. The variety of crafts practiced in Viking York was remarkable. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, their hammers ringing from dawn to dusk. Jewelers created brooches that combined Scandinavian animal designs with Anglo-Saxon interlacing patterns. Leather workers made shoes, belts and bags, often decorated with Norse motifs. Bone workers carved combs, needles and gaming pieces. Glassmakers produced beads that were traded across Europe. This was not a crude frontier town, but a sophisticated manufacturing centre. The houses themselves reflected cultural blending. Vikings traditionally built longhouses, rectangular structures that sheltered both people and animals. In England, they adapted to local conditions, building smaller rectangular houses more suited to urban plots. These houses used Anglo-Saxon construction techniques, but retained Norse features like central hearths and sleeping benches along the walls. The buildings were surprisingly comfortable, with wooden floors covered with rushes and walls insulated with wattle and daub. Diet in Viking England showed clear Scandinavian influence. The Vikings brought new foods and cooking methods that enriched English cuisine. They were particularly fond of fish, especially herring, which they preserved by smoking, salting, or pickling. They introduced new preservation techniques that allowed food to last through long winters. They brought their taste for dairy products, establishing cattle farms that specialised in cheese and butter production. The Vikings also influenced English drinking habits. They were great consumers of ale, but they brewed it differently from the Anglo-Saxons, using different grains and herbs. They introduced new drinking vessels, including drinking horns and distinctive pottery cups. The communal drinking hall, where warriors and workers gathered to drink and tell stories, became even more important in Danelaw society than it had been in purely Anglo-Saxon areas. Clothing in Viking England revealed social status and cultural identity. Wealthy Vikings wore fine wool tunics dyed in bright colours, fastened with elaborate brooches. They favoured arm rings and neck rings of silver or gold, displaying their wealth literally on their bodies. Viking women wore long dresses with suspended brooches connected by chains, from which hung useful items like keys, needles, and knives. This style influenced English fashion, with Anglo-Saxon women adopting elements of Norse dress. The Vikings brought new textile techniques that improved English cloth production. They were skilled at producing warm, water-resistant cloth essential for sea voyages. They introduced new types of looms and weaving patterns. The English word wadmal, referring to a coarse woolen cloth, comes from Old Norse. Viking England became a major cloth producer, with wool becoming one of England's most important exports. Personal hygiene was surprisingly important to Vikings, contradicting modern stereotypes of dirty barbarians. They bathed weekly, usually on Saturdays, which became known as washing day. They used sophisticated combs, tweezers, and razors. They even used makeup, with men lining their eyes with kohl to make them appear more fierce. This emphasis on cleanliness and appearance influenced English practices. The English word Saturday comes from the Old Norse washing day. Viking family structure differed from Anglo-Saxon norms in important ways. Norse women had more legal rights and economic independence. They could own land, run businesses, and divorce their husbands. The keys worn by Viking women symbolised their authority over the household and its resources. When Norse men married Anglo-Saxon women, these different traditions created new family dynamics that gave English women more autonomy than they had previously enjoyed. Children in Viking England grew up in a multicultural environment. They played games that came from both traditions. Archaeological finds include gaming pieces for Jotnafatafl, a Norse board game similar to chess, alongside Anglo-Saxon gaming boards. Children's toys included wooden swords and ships reflecting Viking culture, and whistles and dolls showing English influence. They grew up bilingual, switching between languages depending on context. Education in Viking England was primarily practical rather than scholarly. While Anglo-Saxon England had a tradition of monastic learning, Vikings valued practical skills. Boys learned crafts, trading, and fighting. Girls learned textile production, household management, and herbal medicine. But as Vikings converted to Christianity, they began to value literacy, and some Viking children attended church schools, learning to read and write in Latin and English. The legal system in Viking England created unique hybrid practices. The Vikings brought their tradition of things, outdoor assemblies where free men could speak and vote. These merged with Anglo-Saxon hundred courts to create new forms of local justice. Legal proceedings might use Norse oaths and ordeals alongside English precedents. The concept of weregild, compensation paid for injuries or deaths, existed in both cultures but was calculated differently, leading to complex negotiations. Viking influence on English law extended to concepts of property and inheritance. Norse tradition allowed for more flexible inheritance, including provision for younger sons and even daughters. This conflicted with English primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything. The compromise solutions developed in the Danelaw influenced later English law, creating more equitable inheritance practices. Religious conversion of the Vikings was a gradual and complex process. The first generation of settlers remained largely pagan, worshipping Thor, Odin, and Freya. They buried their dead with grave goods for the afterlife, including weapons, jewellery, and even ships. But they were pragmatic about religion. Many wore Thor's hammer amulets alongside Christian crosses, hedging their spiritual bets. Conversion often came through marriage. Viking men who married Christian women often converted, at least nominally, to please their wives and in-laws. Their children were raised as Christians but often retained knowledge of Norse myths and legends. This created a syncretic religion that combined elements of both traditions. Churches were built on sites sacred to Norse gods. Christian festivals absorbed pagan celebrations. The process of religious conversion can be traced through burial practices. Early Viking burials included full pagan rites with grave goods, and sometimes ship burials. Gradually, grave goods became fewer and simpler. Then came oriented burials, with bodies pointing east toward Jerusalem, but still including some goods. Finally, fully Christian burials appeared with no grave goods, just simple shrouds. Viking art and craftsmanship left lasting impressions on English culture. The Norse tradition of intricate animal interlacing merged with Anglo-Saxon artistic styles to create new forms. Stone crosses from this period show remarkable fusion, with Christian scenes rendered in Norse artistic styles. Manuscript illumination began incorporating Viking motifs, creating unique hybrid designs that influenced later medieval art. Metalworking in Viking England reached new heights of sophistication. Vikings were mastersmiths, creating pattern-welded Damascus steel blades of exceptional quality. They introduced new jewellery-making techniques, including granulation and filigree work. The tradition of wearing arm rings and neck rings as displays of wealth and status influenced English aristocratic culture for generations. Music and poetry in Viking England blended two rich traditions. Vikings brought their tradition of skaldic poetry, complex verse forms that used elaborate metaphors called kennings. These influenced English poetry, introducing new metrical patterns and imagery. Musical instruments from both cultures were played side by side. The Viking lyre existed alongside the Anglo-Saxon harp, and new hybrid instruments developed. Storytelling traditions merged in fascinating ways. Norse sagas and myths entered English folklore, though often Christianized and transformed. The story of Ragnarok influenced English apocalyptic literature. Norse heroes like Sigurd the Dragonslayer became part of English legend. Even Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon epic, shows Scandinavian influence, being set in Denmark and southern Sweden. The economic life of Viking England was more sophisticated than either culture alone. Vikings brought extensive trading networks, connecting England to Scandinavia, Russia, and beyond. They introduced new concepts of credit and investments. They established thing markets, regular assemblies that combined legal proceedings with commercial fairs. These became models for later English markets and fairs. Coinage in Viking England showed cultural fusion. Vikings initially preferred hack silver objects cut up and traded by weight. But they quickly adopted the English system of minted coins. They produced coins that combined elements, featuring Norse designs and English inscriptions, or Christian crosses with pagan symbols. These coins circulated widely, spreading cultural influence through trade. Agricultural practices in Viking England combined the best of both traditions. Vikings introduced new crops from Scandinavia, including certain varieties of barley and rye better suited to northern climates. They brought improved ploughing techniques and iron tools. They were particularly skilled at draining marshland, turning unproductive wetlands into fertile fields. The three-field system of crop rotation, which increased productivity, spread more rapidly in Viking-influenced areas. Animal husbandry showed Viking influence. They introduced new breeds of sheep that produced better wool. They brought superior horse breeding knowledge, improving English horse stock. They were skilled at preserving meat through smoking and salting, techniques that became standard in English food preparation. The Vikings even influenced English vocabulary for livestock, with words like bull and kid coming from Old Norse. The Vikings transformed English maritime culture. Before the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons were not particularly seafaring. Viking settlement created a maritime tradition that would eventually make England a great naval power. Coastal communities learned shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and seamanship from their Norse neighbours. English sailors began venturing further from shore, following routes established by Viking traders. Fishing became more important in Viking-influenced areas. Vikings brought superior nets and fishing techniques. They established seasonal fishing camps that grew into permanent settlements. They introduced the practice of deep-sea fishing, venturing far into the North Sea for cod and other valuable fish. Fish preservation techniques allowed inland communities to consume seafood regularly, changing English dietary habits. The impact on English place names reveals the depth of Viking cultural influence. Beyond the obvious Norse names ending in by and thorpe, Vikings influenced how the English named places. They introduced topographical terms that became part of English vocabulary. Words like fell for mountain, dale for valley, and beck for stream entered English from Norse. Even London place names like Aldwych show Norse influence. The Viking warrior has become an icon of medieval warfare, but the reality was both more complex and more fascinating than popular images suggest. The Vikings who came to England were not mindless berserkers, but sophisticated fighters who revolutionised warfare in the British Isles. Their weapons, tactics, and military organisation influenced English warfare for centuries, creating a synthesis of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions that would shape medieval European combat. The Viking sword was the most prized possession of any warrior. These were not crude chopping implements, but sophisticated weapons that represented the height of medieval metallurgy. The best Viking swords were made using a technique called pattern welding. Smiths would twist together rods of iron with different carbon contents, then forge them into a blade. This created a weapon that was flexible enough not to break, yet hard enough to hold a sharp edge. The surface showed beautiful serpentine patterns, leading to names like snake or dragon for particularly fine blades. A good sword was incredibly expensive, worth as much as a small farm. Warriors gave their swords names like leg biter or skull splitter and passed them down through generations. Swords were decorated with silver and gold inlay on the hilts and pommels. Some had runic inscriptions invoking protection from the gods or proclaiming the owner's prowess. When Vikings were buried with their swords, the blades were often deliberately bent to kill the weapon, ensuring it would accompany its owner to the afterlife. The Viking axe was more common than the sword, being cheaper to produce but equally effective in battle. The Norse developed several distinctive axe designs. The bearded axe had an extended lower blade that could hook enemy shields or weapons. The broad axe had a wide cutting edge that could cleave through armour and shields. By the late Viking Age, the two-handed Dane axe had become popular, a fearsome weapon that could split a man from head to groin. Viking spears were the most common weapon, used by rich and poor warriors alike. A spear required less metal than a sword and was easier to use effectively with minimal training. Viking spears had long leaf-shaped blades good for both thrusting and cutting. Warriors often carried several spears into battle, throwing the first ones before closing to use the last as a thrusting weapon. The best spear points were pattern-welded like swords, with decorative inlays of silver or copper. The Viking shield was round, about 3 feet in diameter, made of wooden planks covered with leather. The iron shield boss in the centre protected the hand grip and could be used as a punching weapon. Shields were painted in bright colours, often with simple geometric designs. The shield wall, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields, was the basic Viking tactical formation. A well-formed shield wall was nearly impervious to frontal attack. Viking armour varied greatly, depending on wealth and status. Most warriors wore leather jerkins reinforced with bone or horn plates. Wealthier fighters had mail shirts called burnies, made of thousands of interlocked iron rings. These were incredibly expensive and time-consuming to make. A good mail shirt could take a skilled smith a year to complete. Helmets were usually simple iron caps with nose guards, not the horned helmets of popular imagination, which were ceremonial items if they existed at all. The Vikings brought new tactical innovations to English warfare. They were masters of mobility, using horses for strategic movement, then fighting on foot. This gave them the ability to strike quickly and unexpectedly. They perfected the feigned retreat, drawing enemies out of position before turning to counterattack. They were skilled at using terrain, choosing battlefields that favoured their tactics. Naval warfare was where Vikings truly excelled. Their longships were not just transports, but fighting platforms. Naval battles involved grappling enemy ships and fighting hand-to-hand on the decks. Vikings developed specialised naval weapons like grappling hooks and boarding pikes. They used their ship's mobility to outmaneuver heavier vessels, attacking from unexpected angles. The psychological impact of a Viking fleet appearing suddenly from the morning mist was often enough to secure victory without fighting. The organisation of Viking armies was more sophisticated than often assumed. While early raids were conducted by small, loosely organised bands, the great armies that conquered much of England were well-structured forces. They were organised into units based on ship crews, with each ship's company fighting as a unit on land. This created natural cohesion and esprit de corps. Leaders were chosen for ability rather than just birth, though noble blood certainly helped. The Viking military system was based on personal loyalty rather than feudal obligation. Warriors followed successful leaders who could provide plunder and glory. This created a meritocratic element where capable warriors could rise to leadership. The most successful leaders attracted larger followings, creating a snowball effect. This system produced highly motivated forces, but could also lead to fragmentation when leaders disagreed. Training for Viking warriors began in childhood. Boys played with wooden swords and shields, learning basic techniques through games and mock battles. As teenagers, they joined the followings of local leaders, learning by observation and gradually participating in raids. There was no formal military academy, but the constant warfare of the Viking Age provided plenty of practical experience. The berserkers were elite Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury. The name means bear shirt, suggesting they wore bearskins into battle. They worked themselves into a rage before combat, biting their shields and howling like animals. In this state, they seemed immune to pain and fear, fighting with incredible ferocity. Whether this was due to psychological conditioning, ritual practices, or consuming psychoactive substances remains debated. Berserkers were feared even by other Vikings, and often lived apart from normal society. Viking fortifications showed sophisticated understanding of defensive warfare. They built circular forts called trelleborgs with mathematical precision. These had ramparts, ditches, and palisades arranged to maximize defensive advantage. Gates were offset to prevent direct assault. Internal buildings were arranged in precise geometric patterns. These fortifications influenced English defensive architecture, contributing to the development of the Bure system. The Vikings were innovative in siege warfare. They built siege engines including catapults and battering rams. They were skilled at undermining walls, digging tunnels that were then collapsed to bring down fortifications. They used fire arrows and burning ships to attack wooden defences. Their patience in sieges was remarkable, maintaining blockades for months when necessary. Psychological warfare was a Viking specialty. They cultivated a reputation for brutality that often secured surrender without fighting. The practice of the blood eagle, whether real or propaganda, terrified enemies. They used intimidation tactics like displaying severed heads or burning churches to demoralize opponents. The Viking war cry and the sight of a berserker charge could break enemy morale before contact was made. The integration of Viking and Anglo-Saxon military traditions created a unique English way of war. The Huscarls, the elite household troops of late Anglo-Saxon kings, combined Viking weapons and fighting techniques with Anglo-Saxon organisation and loyalty structures. They used the two-handed Dane axe but fought in disciplined formations. They were professional soldiers like Vikings but sworn to lifetime service like Anglo-Saxon thanes. The Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, was transformed by Viking influence. Originally a defensive force of farmers, it became more militarized and aggressive. English armies learned Viking mobility tactics, using horses for movement and fighting on foot. They adopted Viking weapons and armour styles. By the 11th century, English armies were among the most effective in Europe, combining Anglo-Saxon discipline with Viking ferocity. Naval development in England was revolutionised by Viking influence. Before the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons had minimal naval forces. Alfred the Great built his navy specifically to counter Viking sea power, but he used Viking designs and often Viking sailors. English ships became longer and faster, incorporating Viking innovations. English naval tactics adopted Viking methods of amphibious warfare. This naval tradition would eventually make England a dominant sea power. The economic impact of Viking warfare was complex. While raids caused enormous destruction and loss, the need for defence stimulated economic development. Towns built walls and organised militias, creating urban centres that became commercial hubs. The arms trade flourished, with smiths producing weapons and armour for both sides. Even Danegeld payments, while draining, stimulated coin production and monetary circulation. Military technology transfer went both directions. Vikings adopted Anglo-Saxon innovations like improved horse equipment and certain fortification techniques. The English learned Viking shipbuilding and navigation methods. Both cultures influenced each other's weapon design and production methods. This technological exchange advanced military capabilities throughout northwestern Europe. The role of women in Viking warfare remains controversial. Sagas mention shield maidens, women warriors who fought alongside men. Archaeological evidence is ambiguous, with some warrior graves containing female bodies, though weapons might be status symbols rather than functional items. What is clear is that Viking women managed defences when men were away raiding, and sometimes accompanied armies to manage camps and supplies. Intelligence and reconnaissance were crucial to Viking success. They gathered detailed information about targets before attacking. They used merchants and slaves as spies. They exploited political divisions, timing attacks when kingdoms were weakened by internal conflicts. Their intelligence networks extended across Europe, sharing information about opportunities and threats. The evolution of Viking tactics in England showed remarkable adaptability. Early raiders avoided pitched battles, using mobility to strike undefended targets. As they began conquering territory, they learned to fight defensive battles from fortified positions. They adapted to English tactics, learning to counter the Saxon shield wall and cavalry charges. This tactical flexibility made them formidable opponents for centuries. Medical care for wounded warriors combined Viking and English practices. Vikings had skilled bone setters who could treat fractures and dislocations. They used herbal remedies for wounds and infections. Some sagas describe sophisticated surgical procedures. English monasteries provided medical care that influenced Viking practices. This medical knowledge was crucial, given the violent nature of Viking Age warfare. The ritual aspects of Viking warfare influenced English military culture. Vikings consulted omens before battle and made sacrifices for victory. Even after conversion to Christianity, some practices continued in modified form. Pre-battle speeches, invoking divine favour, weapon blessings, and victory celebrations all showed Viking influence on English military traditions.